Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 562. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to talk about on today's show. We're really focusing on gray power competition today, potential coming wars with Russia and China, and then I'll be back with another bonus show tomorrow to do an update on what's happening in the Middle East, particularly the situation in Gaza, where it's just becoming increasingly horrific for the people living there. So, along with having at least 4 episodes of Conflicts of Interest this week, both myself and co-host Connor Freeman will be on Judge Andrew Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom. I will be on Tuesday at 4, and then Connor will be on at Wednesday. So there's going to be a lot of great Conflicts of Interest content this week for you all to check out. Please share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. The best place to follow me, and I post every episode of the show on Twitter, is just to follow my Twitter handle at @KyleAnzalone_. Post all my articles there too. All right, let's get into the news today. First story up here. Idaho House Committee votes down Defend the Guard legislation. So this from Dave DeCamp. He wrote last week for antiwar.com. On Monday, so this was last Monday, a week ago today, a committee in the Idaho House Republicans House of Representatives voted down the Defend the Guard Act legislation that would prohibit the state's National Guard from being deployed to a combat zone without a declaration of war from Congress. 4 lawmakers on the House Transportation and Defense Committee voted in favor of the legislation, and 12 voted against it. The bill previously passed through Idaho's Senate, making it the 3rd legislator to approve the Defend the Guard Act. Bring Our Troops Home, the organization behind the Defend the Guard, vowed it would keep fighting to advance the legislation to rein in the federal government's ability to wage war despite the setback in Idaho. As veterans, we're prepared to continue until our brothers and sisters in uniform are given the respect they deserve and are kept out of those undeclared wars. The fight in Idaho and elsewhere is not over. Bring Our Troops Home is looking for volunteers to help phone bank, so if you're somebody who wants to do that, I really suggest you head over to their website. Dave has all the links in his article, and you sign up and you help that group out. Again, they do real good work. Next up, this one from Will Porter. Pentagon still open to U.S. troops in Haiti. A senior U.S. military official said the Pentagon has not yet ruled out an American deployment to Haiti, which has seen a spike in violent unrest that prompted the resignation of the country's prime minister last week. Speaking during an event hosted by the Atlantic Council on Tuesday, the U.S. Southern Command Southcom head General Laura Richardson was asked whether she was envious of the envisions boots on the ground in the Caribbean nation. Not right now, she said, before adding they could be at the end of the day. We wouldn't discount that at any time. Without elaborating, Richardson also went on to suggest that Haitian refugees fleeing violence could be housed at the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay, the notorious torture prison which held hundreds of foreign terrorism suspects without charge for years on end, and there's still a couple dozen there. Haiti has grappled with a long bout of chaos since 2021 assassination of President Jovenel Moïse, who was replaced by Prime Minister Ariel Henry, the West's favorite successor, also assuming the power of the presidency. So Henry became prime minister, but then in Haiti, the presidency is where most of the power sits. And so he just took the power of the presidency too, because he had U.S. popular backing. He wasn't elected into office. He wasn't even a sitting representative when he was made prime minister. He was just forced into that position by the U.S. However, with Henry failing to rein in gains and armed groups running rampant across Port-au-Prince, some even seizing control of parts of ports and other key infrastructure, the Prime Minister Henry gradually lost his international backing, agreeing to resign last week under pressure from Washington and other regional states. The premier will be replaced by a 9-member transition council intended to pave the way for future elections at a yet unspecified date and create an action plan for near-term security, according to the Guyanese President Ali, who helped to broker Henry's resignation. And, it's interesting that the Guyanese president is maybe seemingly taking on a bigger role for the American empire right now, as he is coming up to a potential conflict with Venezuela over a disputed border region, and the U.S. and UK have given a good amount of support to the Guyanese leader to help his country, I guess, posture for a potential war at this point. After repeated appeals to the United Nations for an international security force to help quell the virus, Henry finally struck a deal earlier this month with the Kenyan-led mission backed by other nations and largely financed by the U.S. It is this initiative which Richardson suggests U.S. troops could ultimately join. With Henry stepping down, however, Nairobi has signaled that the multinational security mission will be delayed until the new council is established, leaving it unclear or whether, if ever, the plan will come to fruition. This is from the Kenyan Foreign Ministry. The deal they signed still stands, although with the deployment will not happen now because finally we agree will require a sitting government to collaborate with. You just don't deploy police to go on to Port-au-Prince streets without a sitting administration. Now, one thing that could be interesting here is there are elements within Kenya who are seeking to blot this deployment. And so they could, I guess, the opposition, who have already successfully, appealed to the high court that initially blocked the Kenyan-led mission to Haiti, and it was only after the Kenyan president inked a deal with Henry that they were able to move past that high court ruling and actually plan to send the troops on to Haiti, the Kenyan forces onto Haiti. So, maybe this will open up a possibility for the Kenyans to appeal once again and see if they could find some other way to block this. With a lengthy and often violent history of outside intervention in the country, some Haitians have objected to any foreign troop presence, fearing it will do more harm than good given the disaster experience with previous UN-led missions. The Haitian people have kept their bitter taste of foreign force in charge of our situation: theft, rape, cholera, food disappearances, deregulation of economic system, without mentioning the fact that we don't remember seeing then gang leaders being arrested or rendered unable to do harm. The Haitian think tank said in 2022, soon after Henry first appealed for international deployment. So the Haitians don't want this. I think probably a lot of the American people would rather not get involved in another foreign entanglement, but our government seems intent to. All right, next up here, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on March 21st. Most Americans believe U.S. will be in world war within the next decade. The majority of of Americans believe it is likely that the U.S. will be involved in a world war during the coming decade. Under President Joe Biden, the U.S. is preparing for great power wars with Russia and China, engaged in multiple Middle East conflicts, and posturing for a confrontation with Iran and North Korea. According to a YouGov poll, 61% of Americans responded that it is very or somewhat likely that there would be a world war within the next 5 to 10 years. And interesting about that, when you look at the numbers, only I think about 20% of Americans said that was unlikely or very unlikely. And so 61% said unsure. Another about a fifth of Americans said, I don't know, like pick the middle option. And then only 20% said not going to have a nuclear war. About 2/3 of people responding to the poll said they believe the war will turn into a nuclear conflict if it breaks out. When asked which countries would be aligned against the U.S., a majority of Americans listed North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Russia, and China. Americans identify NATO members such as France and the UK, as well as Israel and Ukraine, as allies in the coming world war. So there's so much interesting here. You kind of have this idea that there's a new axis of evil among Americans, that they're forming this idea. And I think I've even heard some American officials say this even recently. North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China are going to make up this new axis of evil. Maybe sprinkle Venezuela in there from time to time. But that's kind of what they're thinking. Now, there's pretty big disparities between these countries, although I think the U.S. aggressiveness overall has certainly pushed them into feeling more comfortable and relying with each other, and certainly developing more and more economic ties between the four of those five countries. Now, the fifth country, the most interesting addition to that list is, of course, Iraq, where the government there is a U.S. built up government. And so you do wonder if Americans just list Iraq either because they're so used to being at war with Iraq, or because they really don't know the difference between Iran and Iraq, and they're next to each other. And, well, they think that the Iranians have nukes, and so they assume that the Americans do too. Of course, when listing our allies, Israel and Ukraine are interesting choices. Ukraine would probably be the reason we got into a world war, so I guess they would be an ally of ours, although probably not a particularly productive one. I'm not sure the Israelis will ever be willing to really fight for anything other than Israel. Americans are not overly optimistic about the potential conflict. A slight majority believes the U.S. and its allies would defeat Russia, while under half of respondents said the U.S. would lose a war with Russia, with China, or against a alliance between Moscow and Beijing. While most Americans believe a global conflict is on the horizon, they are not interested in fighting the war. More than twice as many respondents said they would refuse to serve even if drafted, then stated they would volunteer if the war broke out. Americans said they would be more likely to serve in non-combat roles or if the homeland was actually threatened. The survey was conducted as President Biden embroiled the U.S. in multiple conflicts, putting America on the brink of war across various global hotspots. The White House is fighting a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. That conflict has escalated in recent weeks as Ukraine is losing territory and lashing out with attacks on Russia. In response, Moscow has lost more attacks on Ukrainian cities and devastated energy infrastructure with a missile barrage last week that's continued into this week. In the Middle East, Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, but in October, he followed Israel into a massive regional war. Washington is shipping thousands of bombs to Tel Aviv. The U.S. is also bombing Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. We're also bombing Somalia, but that's a separate issue here. 3 American soldiers were killed in Jordan earlier this year. Even in the halls of the White House, U.S. officials are concerned that Biden's Middle East policy could lead to a broader war with Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Biden has also continued a military buildup in the Asia Pacific, stoking tensions with North Korea and China. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has responded with a rash of missile tests and fiery rhetoric. Beijing has increasingly pushed back against Washington's support for Taipei and Manila with military drills in the Taiwan Strait and the South and East China Seas. A growing divide in the world economy is further adding to global tensions. A rising number of countries, including Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, Yemen, and Zimbabwe, face significant U.S. sanctions. Economic warfare has led to a growing number of countries forming blocs outside of Washington's control, and Washington, feeling the need to maintain control over everything, is lashing out because of this, and this is creating more tensions and hostilities across the globe. All right, next up here, let's get into how bad the war in Ukraine is getting. Fearing spike in oil prices, the U.S. tells Ukraine to halt attacks on Russian energy. This is one of the crazier articles that I have written since the start of the war in Ukraine. So, U.S. officials are losing patience as Kiev fails to heed American demands to stop attacking Russian energy infrastructure. The White House fears the attacks will lead to an increase in oil prices and trigger reprisals by Moscow. According to the Financial Times, this is what they wrote: the White House had grown increasingly frustrated by brazen Ukrainian drone attacks that have struck oil refineries, terminals, depots, and storage facilities across western Russia, hurting its oil production capacity, adding that officials are concerned with driving up the global oil prices and provoking retaliation. The demand to halt attacks on Russian oil facilities may appear confounding to Kiev after NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg greenlit Ukrainian attacks inside Russia last month. Additionally, President Joe Biden has vowed to cripple the Russian economy, and the West has used sanctions and price caps in an effort to curb Moscow's energy exports. The White House may see increasing gas prices at home as a primary concern with the 2024 election on the horizon. Bob McNally, a former White House energy advisor, said nothing terrifies the same American president more than a surge in pump prices during an election year. As Ukrainian losses on the battlefield have continued in recent weeks, Kiev has conducted more attacks on Russian soil. This has led the Kremlin to evacuate thousands of children from a border region. Ukrainian forces have also successfully attacked 7 energy targets in Russia last week. Washington fears that Moscow's energy infrastructure will prompt retaliatory strikes on Ukrainian energy. Seems to now be materializing. On Friday, the BBC reported 1 million people are without power across Ukraine after Russian missiles targeted energy infrastructure, with Kiev's energy minister saying Moscow aimed to cause large-scale failures of the country's energy system. And that does seem to have continued over this weekend, and there were more strikes, particularly on substations in regions of eastern Ukraine. Now, Kremlin says Russia is in a state of war in Ukraine due to the West's involvement. This from Dave DeCamp, March 21st. This is the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, and he said on Friday that Russia was in a state of war in Ukraine, marking a sharp shift in rhetoric, as Moscow has been referring to the conflict as a special military operation. We are in a state of war. Yes, it started out as a special military operation, but as soon as this group was formed, when the collective West became a participant in this on the Ukrainian side, it became a war for us, Peskov said. He added that he did not mean that the legal status of the military operations has changed. This does not imply any legal changes. It is still a special military operation de jure, he said, according to the TASS news agency, but de facto, in fact, it has turned into a war for us, with the collective West increasingly and more directly enhancing the involvement in the conflict. His comments come as Russia was ramping up missile strikes in Ukraine in what was seen as a retaliation for Ukrainian forces stepping up attacks on Russian territory, which have included drone attacks, raids by militias, and artillery shelling of border regions. Ukrainian officials said Russia's missile strikes on Friday were one of the heaviest attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure of the war. 5 people were reported killed, and over 1 million experienced blackouts. The heavy missile strikes also came as Western leaders have been speaking much more openly about NATO's involvement in the war, with French President Macron suggesting multiple times now that the alliance should consider sending troops, and his bellicose rhetoric has shined a light on the fact that there is a small presence of NATO special operators in Ukraine, which have been there for at least a year. All right, next up here, let's talk about this terrorist attack in Moscow. This is Dave's write-up on it. Russian authorities said Sunday that the death toll in the terrorist attack on the music hall outside of Moscow that took place on Friday has risen to 137. TASS reported the identification of those dead continues. As of now, as many as 137 bodies have been found. 3 of them are children. Russia says it detained 11 people over the attack, including 4 people directly involved in the shooting. A video published on Russian social media showed one man being interrogated, said he was paid about $5,000 to carry out the attack. The 4 men suspected of carrying out the shooting were all citizens of Tajikistan, and 3 of them pled guilty during a court appearance on Sunday night. They will be held in pre-trial custody until May 22nd. ISIS claimed responsibility for the shooting, and the U.S. has backed the claim, but Russia has not formally attributed blame for the massacre. The U.S. publicly warned 2 weeks ago that extremists had planned imminent attacks on targets of large gatherings in Moscow, including concerts. Russian President Vladimir Putin hinted at the potential Ukrainian involvement by saying the attackers attempted to flee to Ukraine and that the Ukrainian side created a gap in the border for them to escape into. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said the U.S. was trying to bail out Ukraine by blaming the attack on ISIS. Both the U.S. and Ukraine denied there were any Ukrainian involvement in the attack. ISIS bears sole responsibility for this attack. There were no Ukrainian involvement whatsoever, said the National Security Council spokeswoman. U.S. officials point to ISIS-K, the Islamic State's affiliate based in Afghanistan, which recently took credit for the bombing in Kerman, Iran, that killed 84 people. Earlier this month, Russian Federal Security Services said it thwarted a planned ISIS attack on a Moscow synagogue. So it seems at least plausible that there could have been a jihad element in here, and that this was more of an ISIS-K attack than an actual Ukrainian attack. Who knows, exactly what was behind this, and, what forces were behind this. I see a lot of fingers being pointed at Ukraine and the West. It's certainly understandable that people would suspect that. The only problem I see now is that the 4 men that were definitely involved were also definitely tortured, to some extent on video. One man was mutilated and had his mutilated body part shoved into his mouth. So there are some pretty rough things going on to these people, and that's not to have particular sympathy to these terrorists who do seem to be the actual guilty perpetrators here, who murdered over 100 people, but rather to say that when you torture people, you're not going to get good information. And I would be highly skeptical of what the Russians put out after this. That isn't to say that there's no Ukrainian involvement, or that I fully believe this was ISIS or something like that. Just that the validity of the evidence, I believe, has been probably substantially contaminated. All right, next up here, Russia says it increased artillery shell production by 150% in past year. The Russian defense minister, Shoigu, said Thursday that Russia's production of artillery shells has increased by nearly 2.5 times over the past year, as Moscow is significantly outproducing the West. He also said that Russia was producing components for artillery at a rate of 22 times of what it could make last year. Speaking about manufacturing of artillery shells, the volume of production of components such as ammunition was increased by almost 22 times. His comments came after a CNN report that Russia was producing nearly 3 times as many artillery shells as the US and Europe combined. The report, based on a NATO assessment, said Russia has the capacity to produce 3 million shells per year, while NATO countries, the US and Europe, can only make about 1.2 million. All right, next up here, Germany won't accept Putin-dictated peace deal in Ukraine. So this is from Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He said this Wednesday, if the Russian president believes that he has to sit out this war and we will weaken in our support, then he himself has miscalculated. We will not accept a dictated peace at the expense of Ukraine. Law is stronger than violence. We will not let him get away with this. Russia is not strong. I think this is really foolish statement, but I thought it was important enough to read on the show. Next up here, the most recent tough comments coming out of Paris. French general says army is preparing for toughest engagement. The head of France's ground forces said in an op-ed published on Tuesday that the French army is preparing for the toughest engagement amid talks from President Emmanuel Macron about sending troops to Ukraine. So this is General Pierre Skill, and he said, to guard against the aggression and defend its interests, the French army is preparing for the toughest engagements. The general said that France would be able to commit about 20,000 soldiers to an allied coalition within 30 days, and that the country could command a corps of about 60,000 men in coalition by combining a French division and national capabilities at the top end of the military spectrum with one or more allied divisions. So, they're really talking and trying to commit to direct war against Russia and Ukraine. Absolute insanity. All right, Biden advisor visits Ukraine, promises more aid. This is National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and he said, and I'm here today in Kiev to say, we believe in you. We believe you will prevail. We believe you will build a bright future for the Ukrainian people, a strong democracy, a resilient, secure country that can repel future aggression, and it's going to be your partner in that every step of the way. I'm also here to say that you should believe in the United States. We have stood by your side since this war began. We have provided an enormous amount of support, and we will continue to do so every day in every way we know how. Just last week, we announced from the White House podium a package of $300 million of ammunition, air defense, and other critical supplies that are needed right now on the front lines, and we are rushing those supplies to you as we speak. We are also going to do everything in our power to continue to support you and your efforts going forward. So there's just so many lies in here, and I wish I could stand here and unpack them all for you. But just the absurdity that all this has been done for Ukraine, and when, especially in the halls of the White House, this is really all about weakening Russia. That's all they really care about or want to do. All right, so about a week ago on the show, I talked about an article that Will Porter had written up that the U.S. was really committed and was really going to start looking, and that the Europeans were actually planning to take the interest from the frozen Russian funds. And, the U.S. is just thinking about using straight Russian frozen funds and use this money for Ukraine, particularly to buy weapons. So this from Dave DeCamp, March 21st. Some Western banks are lobbying against the EU plan to use profits made by the Russian central bank funds that are frozen in Europe to arm Ukraine. Reuters reported on Thursday, actually, that was Thursday last week. The European Commission has proposed sending up to 3 billion euros to Ukraine per year using the about 90% would go to a fund called the European Peace Facility that could be used to buy weapons for Ukraine, and the remaining funds would go to the European Union central budget for other types of aid. Russia has slammed the plan and vowed to respond. This is outright banditry and theft. These actions are a gross, unprecedented violation of basic international norms. We said that we would respond, and we soon shall. And we shall. So we'll see what the Russians do in response. I guess it does depend on if the Europeans move forward with this. And what the Russian says there is actually what the Europeans and Americans have been saying as the plans have been floated for the past. Well, really during the first year of the war, they were very dismissive of them, that would violate too many economic norms, that could lead to, increasing de-dollarization. And now they seem all on board with going through with it. All right, next up here, NATO chief praises Turkey military support for Azerbaijan. During a visit to Azerbaijan over the weekend, NATO Secretary General, that's Jens Stoltenberg, praised Baku's military relationship with Turkey, which helped Azerbaijan cleanse Nagorno-Karabakh of its ethnic Armenian population. The close cooperation between the Azerbaijani army and the Turkish armed forces will greatly contribute to the deepening of Azerbaijan's relations with NATO, Stoltenberg told Azerbaijan's defense minister, according to Azeri media. Turkey strongly backed Azerbaijan's assault on Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 by supplying weapons, and there is evidence Ankara also sent mercenaries from Syria to help in the fight. Israel has also supplied Azerbaijan with weapons, including cluster bombs. The U.S. suspended its military aid for Azerbaijan during the Nagorno-Karabakh War in the 1990s, but resumed it under a waiver in 2002. President Biden signed a waiver to continue providing aid to Azerbaijan in 2022, but did not do so in 2023 due to pressure from Congress. And what happened is in 2022, the Azeris really won the war. They had Nagorno-Karabakh surrounded in a way where they could essentially starve them out. And so over those 2 years, they kind of just slowly tightened the noose. And then in 2022, or 2023, excuse me, that noose was tightened to the point where the people of Nagorno-Karabakh were being strangled. And they were basically forced out. So 100,000 of them fled to Armenia, and now there are no more Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. It was a pretty I hate to use the word, effective with ethnic cleansing, but as far as, militarily going, fairly effective ethnic cleansing campaign. And here we have Stoltenberg praising it. So, it's kind of wild, except you look at what's going on in Gaza and you think, maybe these people just really don't mind ethnic cleansing. All right. Beijing slams U.S. for getting involved in China-India territorial dispute. So remember back to the first article I was talking about on the show today, that Americans think World War III is possible, and this certainly seems like one of the potential starting points. China has hit back at the U.S. for siding with India in a territorial dispute over a state in northeast India that is claimed by Beijing. So this is in the Himalayas region. I believe all this is in the Himalayas region. And there's a really, really good book, War at the Top of the World by Eric Margolis, where he really goes through not just, and he focuses a lot on the situation in Kashmir, the situation between Pakistan and India and Afghanistan as well, but he also talks quite a bit about the situation between India and China, and how there's all these disputed regions, quite literally at the top of the world in the Himalayas, and it's gotten pretty brutal fighting up there. There's been wars fought in the past. More recently, it's been somewhat demilitarized. The militaries are still up there, but they don't have weapons. I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago, there was like a fight broke out between the two sides, and I think 40 people were essentially beaten to death in that fight. So there's a lot of very intense hatred in this area of the world. So last week, the State Department released a statement saying that the U.S. recognizes the Arunachal Pradesh as Indian territory and strongly opposes any unilateral attempts to advance territorial claims by incursions, encroachments, military or civilian, across the line of actual control, the demarcation line separating Chinese control and Indian controlled territory. In response, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said China strongly deplores and firmly opposes this. The China industry boundary question is a matter of those two countries and has nothing to do with the U.S. side. And again, that's a pretty reasonable position for the Chinese to take here. All right, next up, China warns Philippines not to escalate tensions in the South China Sea. China has warned the Philippines not to escalate tensions in the South China Sea following the latest encounter between the Chinese and Philippines vessels in the disputed waters. We warn the Philippines to cease making any statements that may escalate tensions and stop all acts of encroachment. If the Philippines continue to challenge China's bottom line, China will continue to take resolute measures to firmly defend territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests, the Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson said on Sunday. His statements came the day after the Chinese Coast Guard vessel fired a water cannon at a Philippines vessel for trying to resupply a grounded ship on the Second Thomas Shoal, a reef in the Spratly Islands claimed by China, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Wu said the Philippines vessel had illegally intruded waters near the reef, while the Philippines described China's actions as irresponsible and provocative. The Chinese Coast Guard crew said members were injured and the supply boat sustained significant damage during the incident. The Philippines used a grounded ship, the World War II BRP Sierra Madre, as a base of operations in the area, and frequently encounter Chinese vessels when trying to resupply this station, the personnel stationed on the ship. And this is like a half beach ship. It's in probably a couple inches or a couple feet of water, I guess. And it just kind of sits on this reef. And then the U.S. says, well, because that ship is there, this is Philippine territory. All right. I believe this is the last story I have up on today's show. U.S. Air Force plans to spend $400 million to expand Airfield on island of Micronesia. The U.S. is planning to spend $400 million to upgrade an airstrip on the island of Yap, which is part of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Air and Space Forces magazine has reported. The U.S. is working to establish dozens of new airstrips and other types of footholds on the small islands across the Asia Pacific, a concept the Air Force has dubbed agile combat employment. In some cases, the U.S. is clearing away jungles that have overgrown World War II era runways, including an airfield on the northern Mauritania Islands, from where the U.S. aircraft dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. The U.S. Air Force laid out its plans to expand the airfield on Yap. In its budget request for the 2025 fiscal year, the Air Force said an extended runway is required to enable increased capacity of the runway by allowing larger aircraft to land and take off quickly. This increased capacity supports provisions for command and control capabilities, infrastructure for multi-services forces, and rapid establishment of operational capabilities in various locations. If the project is approved, construction will begin in 2025. The Air Force is asking for $96 million the first year, but the project will ultimately cost $400 million. Yap is about 15 miles southeast east of China and is only 46 square miles, making it about 2/3 the size of Washington, D.C. U.S. military leaders have been explicit that the purpose of the expanding footprint in the region is to prepare for a fight with China by giving the Chinese military more targets it will need to hit. And so just, again, going back to this first story here, we're really inching our way towards World War III. We certainly, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to go this way. Humanity doesn't have to die in a nuclear holocaust. We could choose a different option. And as Americans, we have some of the most power and influence to make that happen. Our government is extremely powerful and has the ability to de-escalate almost all the global tensions. Now, can we resolve everything? No. I mean, can we make the Israelis and the Palestinians get along? No. Can we make the Indians and the Chinese, or the Indians and the Pakistanis, or the Pakistanis and the Afghans resolve their border disputes? No. There are some situations that will take these countries working on their own to work out over time, and some things, that may remain at least somewhat low summary tensions for an extended period of time. But the major tensions in the world, the major source of the problems, are driven or at least heightened by the US, and that's what we could help to prevent. So thank you all so much for listening to the show today, and I'll be back with more later this week.